So you love the idea of a private podcast. You're just not sure what to include, how much, how little, what should you be sharing there versus maybe a public show. We're going to get into it in this episode. Welcome to the More Profitable Podcast with Stacey Harris. I'm Stacey, and this is the spot to learn more about the strategies, tactics, and tools you need to build your more profitable podcast. My team and I work every day with podcasters like you to shift shows from frustrating time sucks to productive members of your sales team, because your show should be built to generate and convert leads. So let's get into it. This was one of the many great questions I got when I was looking for questions ahead of episode 600 that I just simply, couldn't include. It didn't make sense in the context of that episode. But I wanted to talk about it in this series because it absolutely makes sense in the context of this conversation. Because one of those questions was, if someone created a private podcast with 10 episodes and wanted to make that available as a opt-in, what would I suggest including in those 10 episodes? Now, this is obviously setting aside the meat and potatoes of the content that you need to be delivering. If you're not sure what that is, I can't help. I could help, but that's not what I do. You're going to need to be looking at, what is the promise of this? And you have to deliver on that. So certainly some of this is going to be that. Don't forget that when you go to include the pieces I'm going to talk about today, because we're not going to address the meat and potatoes of it all with any kind of depth. I really needed that to be here because I didn't want this to be like, cool, I'm going to create these 10 episodes and it's only going to be the things Stacey includes. No. Setting aside delivering on the promise of your opt-in, here's what I would include. That's how we're going to approach this today. Other thing I want to note is that we're looking at a container. We're looking at a set parameter of 10 episodes. This is not a private podcast where you're going to be dropping new episodes weekly, monthly, quarterly, whatever the case may be. There's not an ongoing component here. There is, to some extent, a beginning, a middle, and an end. You're working them through a process. And so we're going to talk about the impact of that. We're going to talk about how that decision needs to be made. But it's something I want you to keep in mind as we talk about this. When I'm looking at something like this, we're looking at this as a product, as a deliverable, as a whole package. Because if we don't think about it that way, it's going to be hard to get people to consistently move through it. So you're going to hear me talk about this almost product-like, almost like it's a course or a program, because in my opinion, that's the best approach to take to building, honest to goodness, any kind of opt-in. I take this approach with building a podcast because I consider this a part of our offers. This is a part of the suite of offers of Uncommonly More, is the More Profitable Podcast, is the podcast newsroom. And so we're going to talk about this with that in mind as we're moving through this process. I think that's all my disclaimers. Before we get into this, I want to remind you, if you haven't yet, there's a private podcast that goes with this show called the Podcast Newsroom. New episodes drop monthly. In June this month, if you haven't listened to that episode yet, I highly recommend making some time to go listen, because we're talking about the things you need to consider if you want to take some time away from the production process of your podcast this summer, but don't want your podcast to lose momentum. I say this as somebody who, in the last couple of weeks, has been sitting down with our clients to build Q3 strategies. And in some cases, we're rerunning or repurposing everything. And they have actually nothing to record for Q3 because they are benefiting from the batching they did early in the year and the strength of the sales assets we have built over the years in working together. So it is possible. If you want to know what that looks like, if you want to know about the things we're considering, make sure you listen to that private podcast episode over on the Podcast Newsroom. Signing up for that is over at podcastnewsroom.com. Jumping into this, I want to talk about these things to include. So again, let's set our premise. 10 episode, free opt-in, private podcast. There are a couple things I want to talk about considering, and then we'll talk about the 3 things that I want you to be making sure you include as part of your delivery mechanism of this podcast. So, things to consider. This is an offer. It sits in our suites of offers. So, we need to first and foremost understand the promise, understand the purpose, understand why this thing needs to exist at all. Not just for you, not just, oh, I want people to get on my email list so that I can sell them, or, oh, I want this to be the on-ramp to my private program, or I want this to be my, ongoing nurture onto my list, my first step onto my email list, whatever those things are, right? But what is the purpose for the consumer? What is the purpose for the person, that lead that's going to get on your email list and consume these episodes? We need to understand what that promise is, because that promise is how we're going to sell it to them. It's going to be the thing that actually gets them to sign up for the thing. But also, it's the thing we're being judged on as far as moving forward in a purchase process, moving forward in a sales conversation. And what I mean by that is, if I can't deliver on the promise I made you in a free opt-in, why on God's green earth would you give me money on a semi-regular basis? Or even just one time? Like, what's the purpose? So if you don't understand what that promise is to them, it's going to be hard to create the content. It's going to be hard to deliver on it. And it's not ever going to be an effective tool. And it's a thing I think not enough people consider at the front of all kinds of opt-in creation. Again, I got the soapbox right back out. It needs to be something you are aware of. And for me, it is the first step always when building something out, like literally anything out, making any kind of decision with the show. It's something we talk about in our audit process. We come back to this and we say, are we still delivering on this promise? Are we still delivering on the purpose of why we create this? I'm prepping content for a new program we're running called the Profitable Podcaster Mastermind. If you haven't checked it out yet, go to uncommonlymore.com/profitablepodcasting. But I'm building out the workshops and the slide deck and finalizing all of those pieces this week. And I'm spending the most time reviewing right now our kickoff month, which will be July, and the audit process. And we spend a fair amount of time talking about exactly this, because it's literally the thing we're judging all the other pieces against. And if you don't understand that, if you can't move people through a process that gets them from problem to promise, your sort of deliverable, it's going to be really hard to ever see that be effective. And it's going to be really hard to understand why it doesn't work. And it's going to be really hard to make the decisions you need to make about whether something needs to be changed at each individual touch point. With that said, when I'm looking at the purpose internally of moving someone through a sales process, moving people from interested to buying, because that's where they are when they opt in. They're interested. They're not a cold lead. They're not somebody who, saw our billboard driving down the road or saw our Instagram ads scrolling by or watching stories. This is somebody who gave us their email address and said, please reach out. So we need to make sure that when we're reaching out in that forward motion, continuing to move them forward. So I don't want to spend a whole bunch of time reintroducing myself or making that beginning all about me, because they're not interested in me. They're interested in getting a result, getting what they requested in the first place. So when I'm talking about what I always make sure we include, and again, we're not going to get into the meat and potatoes of this, but I want you to make sure that you're coming fairly content first, Deliver on that promise, even if it's not, and it's 10 episodes, so it's not going to be the whole thing, but it is going to be an early win. Think about this in the same way you would any other opt-in. So I always like to start out with some kind of early win. Ideally, an early win that helps them stay engaged for the next episode, because we've not built a habit yet. If I can get you to sign up, I can probably get you to open an email. If I can get you to open the email, the job of that email is going to be to go and save that private feed. When I'm talking about saving that private feed now, I need that first episode to be basically securing you listening to the second episode, not buying the program. If we've got 10 episodes to do this in, I'm not selling you the thing that's on the back end of this in the first episode. I'm getting you to tune into the second episode by delivering an early win and giving you a tease for what's next. And so that's a really important piece when we talk about that early content. Now, as we talk about the three sort of things that I want you to make sure you're included, the three kind of episodes, I want you to be delivering case studies. I want you to be delivering a values connection. And I want you to be delivering a sales page. Your 10th episode, if not your 8th or 9th, depending on how you decide to lay it out strategically, I could make a case for it to go in anywhere from 7 to 10, should be your audio sales page or a version of it. Now, the cool thing is when I do an audio sales page here on the More Profitable podcast, the listener is likely more cold or less interested than somebody who's listening to the podcast newsroom and listening to an audio sales page. Because again, that private podcast subscriber listening to the audio sales page on the private podcast has raised their hand and said, "I'm interested, please reach out." That's what they did when they gave me their email address and subscribed to the feed. And so I need to make sure I've got an audio sales page that's driving them to the thing this opt-in is built to convert to. I'm giving them what's next. Case studies. It's like the testimonials on your sales page, love. That's all. I would suggest, as best you can, using the audio sales page and the case studies to also do some of the lift of your values confirmation, meaning this is who we are, this is how we think about this thing. An episode like this is a great example of that. It's the most teachy, it's the most training-y kind of episodes that I do, because we do things a very specific way at Uncommonly More. We approach shows very differently than most podcast producers, than most podcast agencies. Not just in the podcast space as a whole, but even in this sort of like branded or B2B or, business hosted, however you want to talk about the kind of podcast you have, where you are using that podcast to generate leads, convert leads. With those kinds of shows even, we approach things a little differently. We approach things with a very high level of not just podcast strategy, but overall business and marketing strategy. And so that's not going to work for everybody. That's not going to be a connection for everybody. That's not going to be a desire of everybody. If you're somebody who's hosting a show this is just a hobby and it's something you love and you want to talk about. My current obsession is Ted Lasso. I know I'm so late, but I'm caught up. So now I feel like I'm on time. But if I wanted to have a whole Ted Lasso show just because I love Ted Lasso, I would totally call it How to Be a Goldfish, or Being a Goldfish, something like that. But if I were to do that, it would be for me, and that the content I talk about in this show would not be valuable to me, because that's not the goal of the show. And so I need those touch points when we're talking about a contained sales process container. When we're talking about an opt-in, we're talking about nurturing them to a conversion point. They have raised their hand and said they're interested, and we're saying, cool, here's what you need to know to make a decision. And so we do need that values connection to be fairly consistent. So not just in the education and the training you're doing, but even in case study episodes, even in those audio sales page episodes, we need to have that continued values connection, talking about how you're different, talking about what is unique to this offer and why this makes sense at this time because of who you are and what you believe. And that's going to get some people to say no. And that's the point. If it's not shaking people off, it's not attracting people. It's a cliche of marketing, and it's stupid amounts of true. And so you've got to be making sure that you have those values components across the 10 episodes. And some of those 10 episodes need to be those solid kind of sales assets of case studies, of audio sales pages. And again, those case studies and those audio sales pages are going to feel a little different than your public show. I cannot wait to hear how you action on this. So this is one of those episodes I'm really going to ask. Reach out, let me know. Is there something in an existing private podcast that you're going to evolve now? Is there something in a private podcast that you're in sort of the planning or prepping stage for, and you're like, yes, totally all came together for me? I hope so. If you are interested in evaluating an existing private podcast or your public podcast, make sure, if you haven't yet, you have checked out the Profitable Podcaster Mastermind. I am ridiculously excited for this program. It's going to be an absolute blast. It's how we're going to spend Q3 together. We're going to be kicking off talking about your audit, and then we will be moving into building your repeatable series, and then we will wrap up doing your Q4 planning. In addition to building out each of those assets, you're also going to build and document the process you go through to do that, so that you know, here's what I do quarterly, here's what I do monthly, here's what I do weekly, here's what I do annually. All of those components, you will have a documented process and plan for your podcast. It's going to be incredible. I'm so excited. uncommonlymore.com/profitable podcasting is where you sign up. I have not yet I'm going to be really transparent here. I have not yet recorded it, but there will be an audio sales page going up on the podcast newsroom the week this episode releases. So I will let you know in the email list when it's up. So make sure you're subscribed to the podcast newsroom so you can check that out. And again, you can go see the actual sales page and see all of the details and specifics, including a little video of me, by the way, over at uncommonlymore.com/profitable podcasting. I cannot wait to see you in the Profitable Podcaster Mastermind. It's going to be a really fun Q3. And I will see you right back here next week to talk more private podcasting. Bye. Thanks so much for listening to the show. Remember that content consumption does not make changes. So commit to doing something from today's episode. Maybe it's taking action on what we talked about. Maybe it's reaching out to me and learning more about podcast strategy intensives or what podcast production looks like with our team. All of that is over at uncommonlymore.com. And if you haven't yet signed up for the podcast newsroom, I want to remind you that is a great next step. If you're not really sure what comes next, hang out over there. Get those exclusive private episodes. That's over at podcastnewsroom.com. And the last favor I will ask, because social proof is endlessly important for sure, is to leave a rating or review for the show. If you go to ratethispodcast.com/more, that's the easiest way to do it. But I would love to hear what you thought of the show, what you think of the show, and if the show has been helpful for you. I can't wait to chat with you. So this is just the start of the conversation. Reach out so we can keep it going. Talk soon.